Welcome to the meeting of the Corporate Parenting Board, which is the first meeting under the board's revised remit and with new membership. This meeting is being held remotely and members are in attendance via video conferencing. The meeting is live streamed and will also be available for repeated viewing. I will begin by naming the members who are in attendance for the public record and ask members to confirm their attendance. During the meeting, if a member wishes to speak, they will indicate this to me and I will call them to speak in turn. All agenda items are for noting today, and I will ask members to verbally indicate their agreement at the end of each item. I would like to remind members that the County Council standing orders continue to apply, to please keep your microphones muted unless you have been called to speak, and that you may be visible on the screen to the public and to other members even when you are not speaking. I will now call these members in attendance. Members, please unmute and confirm your attendance for the record and to ensure that you can be heard. Councillor Fran Carpenter.
Present, Chair.
Councillor Ross Chad.
Present, Chair.
Councillor Jackie Porter. Councillor Elaine Still.
Present, Chair.
Councillor Patricia Stallard.
Present, Chairman.
And Councillor Malcolm Wade.
Present, Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair.
We also have a number of observers on the call today who the board will work closely with in the future, and I would like to welcome them. Reverend Sue Coleman, the High Sheriff of Hampshire, Ruth Hillman, the Operational Director representing CAMS, Superintendent Claire Jenkins from Hampshire Constabulary, Dr. Melissa Phillips, the designated doctor for looked after children in Hampshire, Naomi Black, the designated nurse for children in care. Apologies for absence. We have one apology received from Councillor Robert Taylor. Declarations of interest. Members, if you have a declarable pecuniary interest or personal interest in any agenda item, please do declare this now or at the time of the item by indicating that you wish to speak. Deputations. There are no.
Chairman, we do have some members with some hands up on that item. Councillor Irish and also Councillor Philpott, Chairman.
Right.
Yes, Chair. Thank you. Is it my understanding that Councillor Porter's not attending?
We haven't heard, have we, Emma?
If Councillor Porter is not present, then you may attend as the deputy, Councillor Irish. That's fine.
That's what I was going to ask. If that's permissible.
Fine. Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Right.
Okay. Councillor Philpott.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to confirm my attendance, although I wasn't read out in the in your list, so I don't know.
I'm so sorry. That must be my fault. Thank you for that. It is my fault. Thank you. Chairman's announcements. I would like to welcome you all to the new board. It's been an experience for three of us over the last 4 years, and what we have done, what we have learnt has been quite amazing, and it gives us a fantastic opportunity to listen and to learn and to question. But the main thing I think I would say to you all is to listen. You hear so much from what children and people who look after them say to you that I think you will be all so impressed by what happens for our children in care and how we can learn from them. And I would like to give thanks to Councillor Fran Carpenter and Councillor Malcolm Wade, who have spent the last 3 years with me. Their kindness and diligence and the compassion for our children has been amazing, and it's been a privilege to work with them. I would also like to thank Councillor Ross Chad, who was our first chairman of the board, and she led the way for us. And we've all been so passionate over this. And I think Ros and I will have one abiding memory of one young boy that we met who was very frightened, didn't think anybody cared for him, and nobody ever kept a promise to him. So Ros and I promised to meet him in about a year's time. And when we did, it was absolutely amazing. We met a very young, confident young man who wanted to progress to be a school prefect. And we heard later that he was. And his ambition was also to be the head boy. Well, because of COVID, we don't know if that happened. But it just goes to show you what Hampshire can do, what people can do to make the lives of our young people in care so much better. So thank you all very much. Board members' feedbacks, engagement and recent activities. I'm going to invite Malcolm and Fran to tell you about one activity that we so enjoyed. So I don't know who would like to speak first.
I don't mind saying something, Anne, if you want me to. I had a little list of the things that I found as highlights. I could quickly whiz through some of them, but I don't want to take away from Councillor Wade's limelight because he'll also have his favourites. But some of the highlights that I have experienced and learned from over the past 2-3 years. The activity week that the council holds for children in care. I visited Tile Barn in Brockenhurst, and it was an outdoor centre week, and that was such good fun, seeing how the children bond and friendships they have. The regular care ambassadors meetings as well, care leavers meetings and care ambassadors, where we hear the experiences that the children have had. That's one of the biggest learning forums, I think. I won't, I've got a whole list here because there's so many, but also I went to a foster carers meeting in Ringwood, and, you know, looking at it from that point of view, how the foster parents share ideas together. It's a really interesting committee to be on, a really interesting board, and I hope that everybody will really enjoy being on it like we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Malcolm?
Thank you, Chairman. I think this is a one-off committee. This is the committee where you get to see the sharp end. You get to see the end user, the people who are really affected by what this council does or doesn't do. And that's the young children, some of the most vulnerable. And I want to pay a little bit of tribute to the chairman, actually. She and Councillor Carpenter and Councillor Chad before demonstrated real compassion and care, because that's one of the things that you really need in this committee in Rowland, because we're dealing with some of the most vulnerable young people who've been through, I think, as Stuart said in the briefing, some really sad and terrible experiences. And this is the chance to be a part of helping them get the life they deserve. And I think it's important. And I've had some amazing experiences. I've been to children's homes, and I was at the meeting where Councillor Briggs and Councillor Chad met that young man. So I totally understand where they're coming from there. But I've been a judge in a We've Got Talent competition, seeing some young children in care really doing some fantastic things. We've met the care ambassadors. We've been to children's homes. We really have seen what the impact Hampshire Children's Services can have on looked after children. And actually, they do what a really good job they do. But as we can always do things better. And the one point I will leave you with is this. on all the other committees that we sit on, and whatever council it is, we get a very aesthetic view. We get lots of pretty charts and figures and costings and all this sort of thing, and we can argue about this, that and the other. But on this one, we see people. We see young people in need, and we see what we can do to help. And you can make a bit of a difference. I'm sure sometimes we've been a bit of a pain to the officers trying to make a difference, but we have been doing it for the right reasons. And it's right to challenge, and it's right to see, because we can't do enough to help these young people get the life they deserve. And you have the opportunity to be a part of that. So I hope you all get as much out of this and able to put in as much as we have. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Malcolm. I think the only thing I will add to that, which we have done, even yesterday we had a care ambassadors meeting, and out of these meetings come some great ideas. And it wasn't at this one, but we have a program called You Said We Did. And that is when you sit around with the young people and they give you ideas. And this is where we challenge our officers. And I wrote, if I may just quickly say this, one of the ones a young person wrote was, they would like improving social workers and other professionals' understanding of the way it feels to be a child in care, possibly by creating a training course. And so we did. A voice library was initiated, collecting experiences from children in care to be included in training for social workers and foster carers. So thank you all very much for listening. Now I think we go on to roles and responsibilities of the Corporate Parenting Board presentation by Stuart, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Colleagues are going to project and share the screen. I would talk briefly to the first two slides, and as in your briefing, Chairman, we will spend a bit more time on the back end of this presentation. For those members that were at the members briefing yesterday, then there'll be a bit more time to digest some of the information in these slides. It's worth putting the context around why we've had to change the setup of the Corporate Parenting Board. We had a very positive Ofsted inspection in 2019, and they talked about the positive impact on children's lives, much as we've heard some feedback from members. But as on the next slide, please, there was a recommendation in terms of the Corporate Parenting Board that it needed to better hold partners to account, including health providers and district councils, but basically all partners who have a responsibility for the corporate parenting role, and that's enshrined in regulation, and that's why this newly constituted Corporate Parenting Board has been brought about, and additionally that's why we've got a range of other partners who you've introduced, Chairman, and they're present, and they will not be so active today. As this is the inaugural meeting, Children's Services will do most of the talking, not all of it, but most. But going ahead at future corporate parenting boards, then partners will be explaining what they're doing to support our children in care and our care leavers. Next slide, please. So just on the phrase "a child in care," members will hear three different phrases, I suspect. And the reason you'll hear three different phrases is because they're in different parts of the regulation. So we typically talk about children in care. That's children who the local authority are responsible for, either with the child's parents or solely responsible for. But you might hear the phrase "looked after child" or even "child looked after," but they all refer to the same thing. It describes a child who the local authority is parenting and caring for. And we'll come on to talk about how long some of those children are cared for. How do they come into the care system? How do they come into the care of the local authority? Two ways. One is where parents say, "Please, local authority, will you help? We can't care for our child any longer." Now, for a small number, that might be because the children have chronic disabilities. For some, and this is relatively typical, would be teenagers who who are going through very problematic times in their lives, perhaps going through some crisis, and parents really feel they can't cope with keeping their child safe anymore. And then the other route is through the court, and typically that court process accounts for about 70% of the children that come into the care of Hampshire County Council. And we will put evidence before the court, and it's a really important point. This, you'll read it in some of the national tabloids that talk about social workers taking children away from parents. Social workers have no authority to do that. Children's Services has no authority to do that. The only way a child can come into care is if the parents request it, or if a judge makes a decision that it's not safe or appropriate for that child to be at home. And about 70% of the children that in the care of local authority are coming in through the court system. And that court process is very, very forensic. We have to go through at least a minimum of 6 months of assessments and attempts to effect change with the parents. The parents will have legal advice and support before we've even gone to court. And then when we do go to court, all of the evidence is played out in front of a family court judge, and the child has legal representation and the parents have legal representation. So it's not a done deal by any means. It's a complex process that has to be followed, rightly so, to test out whether or not change can be effected and children kept safely at home. And our overall ambition is that children are at home. That's what we in children's social care want. Children to be cared for safely and appropriately at home. Sadly, that's not always possible, and then children will come into the care of the local authority. And I think, Laura, I'm going to ask you to talk to the next few slides, please.
Okay, so where do children in care live? I thought that was quite important to add some context. So children can live with foster carers, so they are approved to provide care and have to meet national minimum standards in order to get that approval. They could be with connected carers. So a connected carer is a family or close friend, and they have been assessed again under the national fostering standards, but that assessment is in relation to a specific child known to them. So usually it's a grandparent, an aunt and uncle, or an aunt or an uncle. We have some of our children living in children's homes. So that small group living, generally no more than 4 young people within that home at any one time. And it's very much, you'll see through visiting through the Hampshire homes, it's very much to replicate that home feel, which is why it's a maximum of 4 young people in the home. Supported accommodation, that's an option available for young people who are over 16. And that support could be offered through lodging with another family or in supported or shared living bedside type accommodation. I think it's important to note that with both fostering and residential care providers, they're available through, we have our own pool of carers, and we refer to them as in-house, but we also use independent agencies, so it's independent fostering agencies or the independent children's homes. The question about where care leavers live, care leavers can remain living with their foster carers, and that would come under an arrangement known as stay and put arrangements. That provides consistency of care to support those young people to be better equipped to move on to independence, because not everyone is ready at 18, or not everyone chooses to at 18. Care leavers can be living in supported accommodation. I've just mentioned what that looks like, and they could live with family or friends. They can also be living independently, and equally, we've got care leavers who have gone to university and are at university, and we'll support them with student accommodation. So Stuart's touched upon about how long children remain in care, and in the briefing we spoke about reunification. And I think that's important to know, because how long do children remain in care? The answer is essentially as long as it's required to ensure the safety of children. Mostly, you've heard, children enter the care system because there's no alternative, and it's about, we do plan and we do try to keep them safely at home. When a child is in care, we continue to offer support to the family to hopefully get that child returned home at the earliest opportunity. Or children are placed with extended family members, and it may be a point that they don't feel they need the support from the local authority, and that they can meet the needs of the child independently themselves. So a corporate parent, The aim of the corporate parent is to promote the best outcomes for our children in care and care leavers. And it's looking after and protecting children and young people, and it's one of the most important jobs that a council would do. And I think we've already touched upon it. It's not just the responsibility of children's social care. We all have a very important role to play. And I think that we can't get any clearer of an understanding of what they mean by that. Is if it's not good enough for your own child, why would it be good enough for a child in care or a care leaver? So the role of the corporate parenting board, it's to ensure that all the services are of the highest standard and to ensure that children are supported and encouraged to achieve their potential in school, to ensure that their mental health and well-being is appropriately looked after and having opportunities for positive and social integration. Essentially what we want is that young people will grow and flourish into successful adults that they can become. So how will we do this? So the corporate parenting board, their role essentially is to scrutinise, to make sure and to challenge thinking and ensure it's the best service that we can provide through reviewing the outcomes for children in care and care leavers, ensuring that we hear the voice of children in care and care leavers, and that voice is acted upon and incorporated into plans, policies, strategies, and that service really is adapted in response to what young people are telling us. The board is to ensure that there's sufficient resource available to enable that to happen and raise the profile of children in care and care leavers by promoting the key responsibilities as a corporate parent within your job as elected members. Hold partners and agencies to account in respect of their responsibilities as corporate parents, and ensure that young people know what they can expect from the council as corporate parents. That the corporate parenting board will meet, you've heard, with children care, care leavers, frontline staff, and that's where our work plan of activity will come in. So really ask that if you've got some ideas, you've got some interest, please let us know because we'll try and facilitate that. There may be that the board identifies specific work which we can complete through task and finishing projects to enable a very time-specific piece of work to be completed. Focus on the work will remain in line with the priorities for children in care and care leavers pledge and the local offer, and that will be reviewed on an annual basis. There's a joint working protocol between the Corporate Parenting Board and Hampshire Safeguarding Children's Partnership, where an annual report on corporate parenting is shared with the Safeguarding Children's Partnership. That the Corporate Parenting Board make recommendations to the lead executive member on matters relating to children in care and care leavers. So I've got on here a slide about what the pledge is. I won't go through it in detail, but just in terms of the key headings, that the pledge sets out what we want to offer our children in care and care leavers around their health and well-being, about where they live, listening to their voice, how we can support with education, training and employment, how we can support care leavers on moving on into independence, and what their future will look like. Got a slide here about the membership of board, but you're all here. So again, it's about things to think about being the corporate parent. So about the ability to scrutinise and challenge the services that are provided, assessing whether the standards of care are good enough for your own children, and you need good quality information on which you can base this judgment. There has been an increased number of children entering the care system, and we need to ensure that it is done in the best way and that the right children are in care. We've heard a lot about the voice of the child, and that is really important, which as board members you will get the opportunity to do yourselves. So I think these slides really, when I pulled them together, they've come from the local government association, have given clear recommendations. I would advise that you take a look at that. The link is on this presentation pack, but it's almost a little bit of a crib sheet. So how well do Hampshire do in commissioning and providing services? So that will be about us providing data, county data, but how well that compares nationally. What do we know what the profile of children in care for Hampshire is? What systems are in place to get the feedback from children in care and care leavers? The annual report from the Independent Reviewing Service will be helpful to you to identify any gaps in service. And are the services that are being provided, are they value for money? Education. so the achievements both academically and other. So as corporate parents, we've got to have high aspirations for our children in care. And again, you know, the prompts. What results are achieved by children in care compared to other children? And how do our children in care's outcomes educationally compare with other children in care throughout the country? And how effective are the arrangements with the virtual school head, designated teachers and designated school governors? How are children supported to achieve well, both in and out of school? And how are young people supported to continue in further and higher education? How did the school admission process and policies treat children in care? Personal education plans. Each child in care will have one, and you know, are they of good quality? How do you know that? What do the audits tell you? How many children in care have been excluded? What led to the exclusion? What support's been in place? And what do children in care say about their education and aspirations? Also, how is non-academic achievement promoted and celebrated? We've got health and well-being. We've got evidence that suggests that children in care are nearly 5 times more likely to have mental health disorder than all children. So questions you might want to think about. How many children in care have health and dental check, formulating a health plan and completed within a time scale? Does it all tie into the care plan? Do all children in care have a strengths and difficulties questionnaire? This will look at the emotional well-being amongst other factors of children. Do children in care have priority access to CAM services? What access do children in care have to services for substance misuse or sexual health, for example? And how are foster carers and young people supported to promote healthy lifestyle? Again, what do children in care say about their health needs? And are outcomes and experience used to inform the commissioning of services? Placement stability. So ensuring that placements are stable and work well for children and young people is key for their well-being. Children need to feel happy in placement. So how stable are placements? Do you know how many moves children in care have had within the year? Or how many children in care have been in a placement for over 2 years? What's known about children who change placements? What are the reasons for that? Some of those reasons can be for positive moves. It could be that they've returned back home to family. Why are children placed out of county? And would it be necessary to keep them out of county? What choice do children in care have about their placement? How are they introduced to the new foster placements or children's homes? And if there's a placement move, what's done to try and maintain them at the same school? And what do children in care say about their placements? Adoption. For some children, the best option for long-term stable family environment may be for adoption. For others, securing a permanent home within the care system may be appropriate with family or friends, but securing permanence is important. How many children in care have a permanence plan by their second looked after children review? What percentage of children are placed for adoption within 12 months and subsequently adopted? How long does it take to make a decision to place a child for adoption? What is the profile of our children compared with prospective adopters that are available? Do siblings get placed together? What is the barrier to identifying permanent placements for children in care? And how long it takes to be assessed as prospective adopters? So foster care. Nationally, the number of children placed with foster carers compared to children's homes is about 2/3. Fostering is generally seen as the preferred option, enabling children to remain within a family environment. But do Hampshire have a sufficient supply of suitably skilled foster carers to meet the needs of our children? If not, what's been done about that? What support are foster carers offered? Do carers feel this support is right? And what do children in care say about their experience of foster care? Residential care, very similar questions, and we've spoken about a proportion of children may need to be living in children's homes opposed to foster care. But what's the profile of those children? And what's the Ofsted rating of the residential settings being used? What are the outcomes for children in children's homes compared to the rest of the children in care cohort? Are any children placed in secure accommodation? And what is the experience of children placed within the children's homes? Care leavers. For many young people, leaving care is daunting. Young people cease to be looked after at 18, but the local authority has a responsibility to support until at least 21. How many care leavers are still in contact at 19 or 21? What are the outcomes for the care leavers in regards to their training, employment or education? What support do care leavers receive around housing, tenancy support, employment, access to benefits or support with their mental health? What stay and put arrangements are in place? And what do care leavers say about their experience of care leaving? The effective workforce. So it's essential that each child has an individualised care plan based on the assessment of needs. This is the responsibility of the social worker. An effective workforce supports to improve the experiences of children in care and carers, to improve the outcomes for children and the performance within the department. So what's the current social work vacancy rates and what's the reasons for this? What continuity of social work input do children in care experience? How much time do social workers spend with children in care? What does the annual IRO, Independent Reviewing Officers report say about the effectiveness of care planning? And is there an opportunity for social workers to improve their skills? And what do children in care and carers say about this experience of engaging with social workers and other professionals? So corporate parenting. Is there an effective structure for the governance of corporate parenting? And do looked after children know who their corporate parents are? What do they say about what's expected from the counsellors acting as their corporate parent? Do all members receive training on their roles and responsibilities? And is there an active care ambassadors group who meet with the elected members? Are children and young people's complaints responded to, and what's learnt from this? So I've put a list of the references on here, but I've also, I think it's the next slide, Steph. Oh, sorry, that's the members of the Corporate Parenting Board, the next one. I've put a list of abbreviations that you may hear used, and I use that because Stuart spoke about children in care. Children in care are spoken about CLAR or KIC. There's many different terms that are used meaning the same thing, and I hope that I've managed to capture as much as I can within this. So, is there any questions?
Thank you, Stuart and Laura. Have members any questions? No questions? Don't want to miss any hands this time. No?
Thank you.
Right, well, we'll go on to, this is only to note the presentation. So is there, before we vote, is there any abstentions, any against, or do we all agree the recommendation? Can I see?
Agree.
Agreed. Thank you. Children's social care, response to COVID and impact going forward. Again, we've got Stuart and Laura, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And another presentation just to help members understand how we've been managing the service for children in care and care leavers during lockdown and now post-lockdown, albeit with some restrictions. So if we can move on 2 slides, please. Oh, thank you. Perfect. Sorry, thank you. So our approach, some members have seen some of these slides previously, but I think it's important because we are maintaining our position around this should there be future restrictions imposed. So our approach was to have a 3-phased approach based on increased numbers of staff absence. Phase 1, which was our lowest level with the most available staff, was known as business as usual, but doing it differently. And I'm pleased to say that throughout lockdown and in our current position, which I will come back to, we've managed to remain in phase 1. Doing it differently meant we still saw children, sometimes face to face, sometimes through virtual means such as WhatsApp. All of our timescales remained the same. We made sure that children's plans continued to be progressed. And children in care, we saw them and our care leavers, we were in contact with them, as I said, either virtually or face to face. Phase 2 and phase 3 we never moved to, and as I said, that was around having even less staff. At phase 1 we had around about 20% self-isolating or not available for work during March, April, May, and then the numbers started to improve, and currently we're around about 7%, which is a healthy position for us to be in. And a lot of those staff who are self-isolating are still working. Looking ahead, if we had further restrictions, then our focus would be on supporting our foster carers, supporting our children's homes, and keeping our multi-agency safeguarding hub up and running. We have to prioritise those services because those children have got nowhere else to go. They're in that's their home. So we have to prioritise supporting our foster carers and our children's homes. And of course, the front door to children's services is through the multi-agency safeguarding hub with our health and police colleagues. And that's where the urgent incoming work comes through. So we have to make sure that that is maintained. Next slide, please. As predicted, as the lockdown progressed, then initially we had less demand coming in for children's social care. As you've got a year-on-year comparison there from April to April and then through to August. What happened through May was we got back to normal levels of demand for social care, which I have to say surprised us to some degree, because whilst vulnerable children were in school, the majority of students and pupils weren't. Yet the demand coming through the MASH for social care remained high. And then through June, July, August, September and into October, we have seen around about 15% over and above normal demand. And the complexity of the work coming into children's services has been, and in fact I was discussing this with managers this morning, it's been unusual. It's been much more complex than we would normally expect to see, and much more difficult in terms of what social workers are having to deal with. We suspect that's because during lockdown, families weren't able to access earlier support from other agencies they may have been normally getting that support from, and they reached a point of crisis. And of course, at crisis, that's often when children are at the most vulnerable within their home environment. So we've seen an increase as a result of that, of children becoming subject to a child protection plan, and an increase in children coming into care. So I know last month there was a net increase of 38 children coming into the care of the local authority. And of course we have to find placements for those children. We have to make sure that their plans are in place and begin the process of, can we reunite them with their families, or do we look to achieve permanence through another route? Next slide, please. Throughout the spring and summer, we worked with the schools, very closely with all of the schools in Hampshire, and with Brian Pope and his service, Education and Inclusion Service, to make sure that as many vulnerable children, including our children in care, were accessing their school. And the schools were very accommodating. They know their children in care, and they worked very closely with social workers, where if children were struggling to come to school, if they were anxious to come to school, or indeed if the foster carers were anxious about them coming into school and perhaps picking up an infection, then they worked together around the foster carer to support them to make sure those children could access their school. Next slide, please. There are partners in this meeting today, and as I've said previously, you will hear more from them over the coming months at this board. But there's been some very, very strong partnership working, I think particularly between Children's Services and the police, but of course with our health colleagues as well, to make sure that those children most at risk, some of our children in care who didn't really understand or couldn't socially distance, that we supported them and made sure that they were safe. Next slide, please. And then just something around unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and apologies for the acronym there. Make sure I think it's in Laura's glossary at the back of her slides. So unaccompanied asylum-seeking children come into the country through two ways. One is that they come into the country two ways. Come into the care of the local authority two ways. The first way is if what's known as a spontaneous arrival. So if a child, if an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child is smuggled in the back of a lorry, and that lorry stops on the M3 and the child gets out, if that's in Hampshire, then that child becomes a looked after child, a child in care to Hampshire. And we have a range of duties around them. We have to undertake specialist age assessments to work out how old the child is in the social worker's best judgment. But from that moment, if it's in Hampshire, they're a Hampshire child in care, and we have full responsibility for them up till they're 25. The other way that a child can come into the care of Hampshire is through what's known as the National Transfer Scheme. So Kent, because of Dover, has a significant number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and on a rota basis, some of those have been dispersed to other local authorities, and Hampshire's been a strong supporter of that. I think it's worth saying at this point around unaccompanied asylum-seeking children that there are really 2 or 3 issues with the whole scheme of support for them. Firstly, the scheme, the National Transfer Scheme, is a voluntary scheme, and not all local authorities participate in it. So therefore you have an unnecessary, in my view, and an unfair burden on those local authorities that do accept children through the National Transfer Scheme. It was put to me very, very well that it's a major local problem for Kent, but actually if those children were dispersed fairly to all local authorities, it would be a minor issue for all those local authorities as a collective. The Association of Directors of Children's Services are lobbying hard that actually the scheme should be mandatory so that there's a fair distribution of these vulnerable children. And they are incredibly vulnerable. Some of them have travelled 6-9 months to get to the UK, but equally there should be a collective responsibility for their well-being and how they're cared for. And this may be another subject that this corporate parent board would want to have more details on in the future. Next slide, please. Naomi, I know that you're here. I wonder if you'd like to come in and talk about the slide, if you're able to.
Yes, thank you very much. We obviously wanted to make sure we supported our partners and particularly supported our children and young people through the COVID period. Guidances came out from NHS England early on that the requirement to continue initial health assessments for these children coming into care was an absolute mandatory requirement. And we managed to facilitate that, although how we delivered it, we had to be quite creative. Quite a lot of virtual, but every child that we could, we actually managed to make some contact with to get some health overview on that. For those children that were in the care system already who were requiring their statutory review health assessments, we had to pause to start with so we could make sure we released the staff to cover for the initial health assessments and actually risk rate those children to see if there was children that we needed to see as a priority. As it turned out over the period of time, most of the requests that we received to undertake these assessments were actually concluded and undertaken in a timely way and were still done virtually and will continue to be virtual because we need to be mindful at the moment that we're going into a second phase. We also wanted to make sure that we're working in partnership with our local authority colleagues and others about how we can do things differently going forward. One of the things that is very challenging is some of this statutory requirement is now actually quite old. And actually we've moved on in different ways of delivery of assessments. The IT systems are very different. And actually the voice of children and young people is very loud and very clear. And working as part of a rapid review event in September, we're aiming to try and improve the delivery of the health assessments and the healthcare pathway for children in care going forward. And it's our absolute direction and our importance to support our partners, but most importantly, support children and young people in actually attaining their health needs and identifying them and supporting them.
And now I'm going to bring Laura back in because Laura was instrumental with a lot of the activity that took place during the lockdown period around supporting our children in care. And I think, as Councillor Wade said about judging a talent contest, there were some really, really interesting and novel ways of keeping engaged with our children in care. So Laura, over to you, please.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to add this slide because I think we've all had to adapt and everyone's adapted very well to working in a different way and how we could engage young people within that. And I've just put those 3 pictures. There were actually some 3 of the submissions for the We've Got Talent competition. And it was really to give young children and young people something to do that's a little bit of fun, but also what came out of it was the talent that we've actually got within our cohort of young people. People were achieving many things for the first time. So that was really exciting. There was also some podcasts put together, which I think Councillor Briggs, Councillor Wade and Councillor Carpenter all supported with. And I think it's actually your link that I put on the next slide if anyone wanted to listen. But it was just about sharing experiences of what it was like going through this pandemic, which has never been experienced before. So it was really just to see that, you know, young people and care leavers, staff have all supported young people in very different ways. Visits were virtual. In terms of engaging young people, they were using quizzes. There were activity packs were delivered to foster carers for the young people to do. And it was that I know that staff pulled together videos that then sent out to all their young people just to say, well done, keep going, and really get that motivation going. So yeah, I think it was just to put on there how people have been creative and how we've tried to continue to engage children and young people and care leavers in very different ways.
Thanks, Laura. And then the last slide on this is about what next. What happens? How are we going to adapt to whatever restrictions or freedoms are available? For our children in care, for a small minority, it was a challenging time. As I said previously, they struggled with social distancing and not really being able to go about their lives as normal. For the vast majority, it was fine. They were well cared for, whether in a children's home, in a foster home, and their carers explain things to them, their social workers work with them. And if we go back into restrictions, then that will just apply. And I see very little detriment, other than it being an inconvenience on people's lives, of course. But I see very little detriment to them, particularly with the schools staying open. And that's the commitment that we're told there is. All of our visits now, virtually all of our visits are face-to-face. I would say 95%. There'll be a small number, particularly with the older cohort, where actually it's better to have a virtual visit because they're more comfortable with that. And again, if the situation changes and we are required to adapt, then we'll go back to virtual visiting. We always know our children who we need to see face to face. So social workers can use PPE and social distancing to make sure that the most vulnerable children in care and care leavers get the support they want and need. So we're optimistic that the service is very adaptable. We've got a tremendously committed workforce, and I'm confident that we could face whatever challenges come our way. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, and thank Naomi, Laura, and you, Stuart. Is there any questions for members, please? Councillor Wade.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I've got a question for Stuart. We knew that post-lockdown the number of referrals would increase. Since August, have the number of referrals plateaued out? And do we expect, God forbid, if we have another lockdown, will we then have an increase post that as well?
Yes, they have plateaued out, but they plateaued out at about 15% higher, Councillor Wade, than this time, well, where we would expect them to be. At one point, year-on-year comparison, we were 60% higher, but that was the very peak of demand upon us. This was compared to last year, 60% compared to last year, but we have plateaued at around about 15% higher than normal for demand, in terms of demand.
Sorry, go on.
And the second part of the question, if we have a further lockdown, do I expect that to be the same pattern? I absolutely do, yes. I expect demand to diminish in the very short term and then to be even higher post any second lockdown.
Should I just come back? I mean, the issue with this is what happens to families when they're in a lockdown situation, and some of the issues that come out of that, which perhaps don't come out normally. There's nothing we can do about that, is there?
No, and sadly there isn't. I think most agencies have adapted the way they offer services to families, to children and families, in terms of maybe being able to maintain more contact, because I think that was everybody's first experience of a lockdown, and many services just stopped, understandably, and staff were needed in different roles. I think there's probably more flexibility around a number of all agencies now, so that we can keep services to vulnerable children and families more accessible. But in a lockdown, yes, there's not an awful lot we can do if we're not able to have direct contact with families, because we may not know them at all. They may be entirely new to children's services in that sense.
Thank you.
Councillor Carpenter.
Thank you. Yeah, Stuart, I just wondered, the multi-agency safeguarding hub, which is at the front door where the calls come in from the schools or from neighbours or whatever worried about children. When I went and visited there about a year ago or so, it's very much everybody sitting together, police, nurses, health professionals and the social workers. How is that actually working now? Because I used to have immediate meetings, go into a little room, because I was fascinated, going into a little room, discuss that case, and it's acted upon immediately if it's urgent. I don't know how they can do, how are they doing that now? Just curious.
This might give me an opportunity if Mel's still on the line. Mel Golding is Chief Inspector, may want to come in, but I'll just from a children's services perspective, initially we based all of our staff at home, so they were able to work through Teams. They adapted to the use of technology. We have brought some staff back in actually, and in terms of the MASH, social workers are saying they find it really lonely working in a MASH team on their own, sat at home. So we've recently begun some work to make sure that we can get MASH social workers back into the building safely, because I think they need that support from each other. But it's been challenging, but the front door, I have to say, has just remained as was, albeit virtually. Mel, are you able to talk from a police perspective?
Yes, thank you, Stuart. I'm happy to. Thank you, Chair. From a police perspective, I think very similar. We've been having most of our MASH working remotely, although surprisingly, it's been working very well. And despite that usual in-person teamwork, they're managing very well virtually. So that's continuing, and many are working from home, appreciating the demands on the logistics for our colleagues in children's services and the strains on how many spaces there are in the buildings to be able to co-locate at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Councillor Powell-Hare.
Thank you, Chair. Stuart, I think my first question was almost answered. Councillor Wade asked, it was about demand and supply. Considering the demand went up after April and there wasn't enough supply, going forward, what plans do you have for meeting demand and supply?
I'll answer that in two ways. In terms of demand at the front door, with new referrals coming into children's services, the County Council has made additional funding available to the service so that we can ensure that we've got the right numbers of staff to deal with that. And in fact, we have taken more social workers and an extra 2 managers into the MASH to make sure that we can service that demand. And there's further funding available should we need it. I hope we don't have to call upon it, because we've had significant corporate funding to support children's social care over the last 3 to 5 years. In terms of demand later in the system, I'm thinking now around children in care. Some of the work that's coming into the service now, some of those children will end up staying in care. And we're doing a lot of work around that, increasing the numbers of foster carers that we have available. That will take time because it's a lengthy process to assess and approve foster carers. But really interesting, we've had an increased number of inquiries about becoming foster carers, particularly during lockdown, but the numbers of inquiries have remained higher than normal. And we think that's because people have reflected during lockdown on what's happening in society about vulnerable children and families, and perhaps how they're able to make more of a contribution to that. So that's been a really interesting byproduct, shall we say, of lockdown, and we're doing everything we can to capitalise on increasing the numbers of foster carers we have.
Chair, may I just ask one more question, just a brief one?
Okay.
With children, unaccompanied children, illegal children coming into the county, do they immediately go into care, or if they have an extended family or friends in the country, would they be placed with them?
That's a really interesting question. They do immediately come into care because they are found, they're usually detained by border police, and then we, Children's Services will undertake an age assessment, and we will place them in foster care. Now some, a very small number, some do have relatives, perhaps in some of the larger cities, and we will then work with the child, we'll contact those the family, we'll obviously undertake assessments, and if possible, yes, they will go and be placed with their extended family. So I know a recent case where a young boy arrived in Hampshire, and he was then placed with his older brother, and that's a really positive outcome for that young person. However, the vast majority will arrive with no documentation. Often their use of English is very limited. They may not even know their own date of birth or when they were born. So it's quite a sort of an intense process that we have to go through around getting to know that young person, and then making sure that, I mean, if we do find any links, that we always assess those, but the majority will not be that well organised, if that makes sense.
Next question, Patricia Stellard, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Stuart, I'm afraid I've got one or two questions to ask you. On page 46, there was a line, I'm talking about the COVID presentation now. You said by the end of term, 53% of vulnerable children were attending school. Now, we know that was above the national average, so that's good, but it still leaves 47% of our vulnerable children not attending school. Now, if that was last term we're talking about, the end of the summer term, which I guess it probably is, I think it would be worthwhile sharing with members of this committee the action that we took to keep an eye on and continue to be responsible for that 47%. And also, do you have an up-to-date figure? What is the current figure for the number of percentage of vulnerable children returning to school? That's one question. My second one is on page 52, again of the COVID slide. You say that COVID safe family centres will be reopening as and when appropriate. So my question is, how many opened? How many? Where? All right. The third and final question is, we talked about the use that we've made of IT during the COVID period, and that has been absolutely crucial, as every member of this committee has heard this afternoon. What feedback have you had? I mean, I actually know the answer to this question, but I think it's quite useful to share it with colleagues. What feedback have we had from the young people themselves, and indeed from the families who may not have been very IT literate in the past? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stallard. I'll take the questions in the order you raised them. So in terms of during the spring and summer, when the schools were open for vulnerable children, Councillor Stallard's entirely correct, we had around 53% of vulnerable children. Now, we in Hampshire, we decided that the term vulnerable children wasn't just children open to social care, but also those pre-social care that we offer an early help service to. So it was a very large cohort. Every child known to children's social care or early help, we undertook a risk assessment on those children. And just because they weren't in school doesn't mean that they weren't being seen. There may have been very genuine reasons why they couldn't go to school. For example, if they were living with an elderly relative who would have been classed as vulnerable and needing to shield. So there were some very legitimate reasons why it wasn't appropriate for some children to go back to school. And there were some anxieties from some families, of course, and we understood that. And the social workers and the early help workers worked to try to support those families. For those children who we were particularly concerned about, then we were more interventionist, is the word that I would use. Social workers were more influential in perhaps pressing families to say, actually, your child is better off in school because actually we know that they'll get a free school meal, that they'll get the support that they need, etc. So I think it was a really positive story, and members shouldn't for one moment think that if they weren't in school, they weren't being seen or worked with, because they absolutely were. I'm very confident about that. And those risk assessments were updated very regularly. And of course, in children's services, we have a churn of children. So it's not a static cohort. We have some children who then we don't need to work with anymore. We have new children coming in through the MASH, as we talked about. So there was a constant churn and constant updating of children's situations, which is understandable in circumstances. In terms of where we are now, I agreed with Brian Pope that we would make sure that schools could notify senior managers if vulnerable children didn't return to school at the start of term. We had, I think, 7 or 8 notifications from schools that they were concerned that the children hadn't returned after summer holidays, and we followed up on those individual cases. It was a very small number, actually. I expected to receive a lot of email traffic, but it just wasn't there. I think, and I do genuinely think this, that most families wanted their children to go back to school come September, and so attendance has been very good indeed. And again, Hampshire has outperformed nationally on attendance. Your second question was around page 52 and the opening up of family centres. So I'm just looking for page 52 so I get the line right. Around family centres and opening children again, their families safely reopening. Yes, re-establishing contact. Now, actually, this is a really interesting one. You asked how many family centres have been opened. If I couldn't give you an exact number, I certainly can do outside of this meeting. But the majority of our contact centres are now open again. We came under pressure very early from the courts, rightly so in my view, to re-establish face-to-face contact between families and their children in care. And we've been able to do that in a safe way. The buildings have been made COVID secure, and children are having a lot of face-to-face contact. There may be 1 or 2 cases where that's not happening for the right reasons about protecting people's health. But we're back to normal in terms of contact between children and their families. And then your third question, I think, was around IT and how the experience of it, and also for those that didn't have access to IT. So the experience of our children, particularly our children in care and our care leavers, has been overwhelmingly positive in terms of their access to IT. They've liked using WhatsApp, they've liked using Teams, and to be honest with you, they're far better at it than we are. It's us that's had to learn. They were already doing it. So, and actually, it's something, rather than being face to face with your social worker talking about difficult issues, sometimes it's easier through a screen. It's a bit like not quite having direct eye contact. We often find that children are more comfortable talking in a car prior to COVID because they didn't have to look directly at their social worker when engaging with them. And I think there's something similar about that through the use of technology. And the final part of that, for a small number of families, they haven't had access to IT. We were given laptops from the Department for Education to give to care leavers and children in care who had no access. And we've also had similar for those when we've gone out and purchased laptops or smartphones so that families can have access to social workers, attend meetings. So it's you know, we've had to deal with it on an individual basis, but I think again it's been a success story. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's no more questions, so members, we need to note the presentation. Any abstentions? Any against? Do we all agree the recommendation?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you. So we go on to the Big Activity Week, page 57, presented by Charlie Mills. Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So for those of you who don't know me, I manage outdoor education as part of the education and inclusion team, but I'm also a very proud in-house foster carer of 3 lovely teenage boys at the moment. So in 2019, as many of you know, and Councillor Carpenter mentioned in her report, we had a fantastic first big activity week. And we had 76 looked after children came along to a variety of different centres across Hampshire and had Monday to Friday residential experience of doing a variety of different outdoor activities. So they could have been kayaking or skiing at Cowshot. They could have been learning about the chickens and the sheep at Minstead. So a variety of different activities. We had amazing feedback from that, and we wanted to get bigger and better in 2020. And we planned a fantastic big activity week for August. We had over 100 young people booked on, and obviously, disappointingly, COVID hit. But luckily, we still had £10,000 that I needed to spend of National Lottery funding that wouldn't have rolled over, and we would have had to pay it back. So we set about trying to make something significant for those young people. As a carer of, well, obviously those 3 children, but my 3 own children as well, being locked down with 6 children, as you can imagine, was quite stressful and did have its challenges. So actually what we really wanted to do was give a little bit of respite, because actually, you know, people didn't have their holidays to look after, to look forward to. So to give respite for those families and give a little bit of opportunity as much as we could, but obviously the impact wasn't going to be as big as possibly a residential offer would have been. So what we did was we booked a variety of different day activities at Stubbington Study Centre, Peter Ashley Study Centre and Runways End. So at 3 varying different places across the county, and lots of our young people booked onto those. We also did more family-based activities at Cowshot. So so myself as a carer booked on with our 3 boys, and we went skiing as a family and kayaking as a family, and that was absolutely fantastic in our own little bubble to do those family activities. And a really unique one at Tile Barn, where you could book a day at Tile Barn and an overnight, so that the camp was there ready for you, and you did some cooking together, you did some activities together, and then you camped over as well. So it was actually a night away for some of them in their family groups as well. We spent the £10,000, which is good, don't have to pay a penny back, and we are looking to 2021. Now, obviously, outdoor education has been in the news very much recently. There's no residentials currently happening. However, a week is booked in August with the same plans as last year, because obviously I paid deposits, so many of them have just rolled over. So we plan to have 110 young people booked on to our residentials next year, doing similar kind of things at 5 different centres. When I first launched the 2020 plans, many of you may remember that we're looking at taking a group out of England for the first time. So we're going to the Mountain Centre in Wales with some of our older cohort. So really looking forward to that. So yeah, that's the big activity week. We also missed out in May on a new venture for this year, which was the big hike, and we had 20 of our key stage 4 young people, so mainly 15 and 16, which are very often the more challenging ones to engage with. And they were going to climb Snowdon, and we were driving down in one day. We were going to climb Snowdon after a wild overnight camp. So we hope to get that going again in May, fingers crossed. If not, we may be able to put it a little bit later back, so that because we did have a really nice cohort booked on that. And finally, just summing up the Duke of Edinburgh Award cohort that we've got going through at the moment. I've got 2 of my boys have signed up for it, and many others across the county. I've tried to get them encouraged to do their other sections, not necessarily their expedition sections, but to get as many young people through the Duke of Edinburgh's award as possible. We're working closely with Swanwick Lodge, and we've got a few young people started doing their D.A.V. there, and also we've got many young people that not all looked after, but in other secure settings, that NHS settings at Bluebird, Austin and Lee House. Many of those children obviously are looked after, and many of those have been accessing. We had 16 complete their award over lockdown in those settings, which is pretty amazing considering some of the reasons that cohorts are obviously in a secure setting. So yeah, lots going on behind the scenes.
Thank you, Charlie. It's very interesting. Any questions, members? No? Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Charlie. Members, we need to note the content of the report and to support the promotion of the BEG Activity Week 2021 with a thorough programme of activities throughout the year for children and carers to get outdoors, engaged in exciting, accessible activities. Is there any abstentions? Any against? Do we agree the recommendation? Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Chair, could I just say, I should have said, just Charlie was one of the ladies that ran the activity week when I went there, and she's superb. Just wanted to put that on the record.
I know, her enthusiasm is amazing. Thank you, Fran. And now it's this virtual school update report. Nicola Blake, please. Have we, Nicola?
Hi, good afternoon.
Thank you.
So this gives a sort of overall picture of the education sort of context in Hampshire. So obviously during this time there were some well-documented last-minute changes to the grading systems for GCSEs and A-levels, which members will know. I have to say, in terms of our children in care, we actually had an increase in their GCSE outcomes. So an increase in those receiving English and Maths level 5 to level 9 and level 4 to level 9. So they had done very well. Obviously, one of the issues that was raised for us was about making sure the careers service was open and guiding students, and that transition into post-16 support was in place. And the schools and colleges worked very hard to ensure that students were well supported and that their pathways were secure, with colleges being very flexible and supportive about year 11s who wouldn't normally have had, some of the transition planning wouldn't have taken place. We have low NEET figures anyway. This has continued with our year 12s. At the moment, we're about 97% who have a destination and who are in college. Obviously, what we want to do is make sure they're well supported because of the risks maybe that they didn't have some of the transition work that would have ordinarily gone on. So in terms of the next slide, please. So there's been regular contact with school leaders services out in schools now between the local authority and the education team and schools. We've got a relentless focus on vulnerable students, persistent absence being a concern for some children and young people, but also obviously for our children in care, just making sure that transition back into school is well supported. Designated teachers in schools. There's been a statutory responsibility that there's a designated teacher for looked after children in schools, and the virtual school has really focused on making sure that they're trained and that they have the capacity and that they're supported so that we can really keep the needs of those children at the forefront of all the planning in schools. We also are wanting to make sure that we're part of this sort of push out of evidence-based catch-up provisions and strategies, looking at the recovery curriculum. That's about sort of making sure that children's experiences during this difficult period are well supported by schools, and we understand where there's been gaps and where children might need particular catch-up, where their skills need to be worked on in order to kind of manage back in school settings. And there's also a national wellbeing programme which the virtual school is part of. I mean, one of the things to note is obviously that in terms of our expectations that every child and young person has a personal education plan, which has been mentioned, and it's really important that we keep that those processes in place, and that we look at those and scrutinise those personal education plans to make sure they reflect needs, that they have good and effective targets, and that we're working to support children where there might be gaps and where they might need additional support. And as I said, we've put a lot of focus on training and support for schools. We've had a good response from designated teachers, and they're seeking us out as and when they need us in order to provide quite bespoke interventions and training for schools where that's needed. We're looking very hard at our data and tracking it very carefully to make sure that we're picking up if children have had any fixed term exclusions, if where we're concerned about any aspect of progress. And we're just about to look at the PEPs again, with a real focus on those children year 6 to 7, but also those children going in 11 to 12. And we're going to really prioritise looking at our year 11s just to make sure that we've supported them appropriately, that their plans are up to date, and that we can put in the right interventions to make sure that their academic year is as well supported as possible.
Thank you, Nicola. Have we any questions, please, members? No? Well, thank you very much, Nicola, for your presentation. Members, we need to note the presentation. Any abstentions? Any against? Do we agree the recommendation?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of the webcast. Thank you very much, Emma. And thank you very much, members, for listening. And I think